Okay, welcome to the fourth lecture in Unit 10. I want to draw your attention to your outline for this week. Note that you have Journal 28, and your other assignment is Why I Wrote the Crucible. You're going to read a little bit about Arthur Miller's The Crucible and its relevance to the Cold War. And then there are about 7 to 8 questions to answer after that. Make sure you're responding in complete sentences. You also have your unit short paper due this week. That's due on Friday. Go back, look at the comments from your previous paper so that you can improve in this one. Make sure that you are following the guidelines that are posted in the rubric as well as the assignment description. Your unit exam will also be posted on Friday. It'll close at 11:45 because that's the latest that forms will allow it to be open. Make sure you look at the study guide that is posted in Teams as well as sent to you in your This Week in U.S. History email. That study guide will have all of the topics from the test as well as a preview for your extended response to help you get ready. All right, let's jump right in. This week we are going to first start with Cold War containment in Europe and Asia. We are going to look to the expansion of communism and the response of the United States to that expansion. Now, last week we went over the definition of a Cold War, which you told me was a war without violence, and you are correct to some degree there. And I'm going to challenge that definition today when we look at the events that come about during the Cold War, where it's that fight between the United States and the Soviet Union to kind of see who's going to have the most allies, who's going to have the most land in under their umbrella of control. Remember, we're getting rid of the idea of imperialism and we're kind of controlling these places by instilling the same ideology and then getting trading partners, allies in that way. So let's jump right in. NATO. When we look at NATO, it is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to be the full name there, and NATO is going to form as a response to the actions of the Soviet Union. In 1948, you saw this in your documents last week, there will be a coup sponsored by the Soviet Union to overthrow the democratic government in Czechoslovakia. And when we see a communist camp being instilled, defeating the democratic government, the United States begins this joint discussion with European allies to try to figure out how can we collectively secure these nations post World War II. This process is also going to gain some urgency after the USSR instills that blockade of Berlin and the US is forced to execute an airlift into the city. And these actions by the Soviet Union are going to create an environment where an alliance needs to be built. So, for the first time since the 1700s with NATO, the United States is formally going to tie our security to that of nations in Europe. This is huge. Remember, our foreign policy used to be neutrality, stay out of it, no entangling alliances. This is everything that we wanted to avoid. We are literally tying the safety of the United States, the idea of the United States going to war, with European nations. The original membership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to consist of countries like Belgium, Britain, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. And what ties these places together is this idea that they will all be the backbone of the West, using military force against the USSR and the allies of the USSR for the next 40 years under the idea of containment. Greece and Turkey are going to be added into NATO in 1952. The Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, will be added in 1955, and Spain will be added in 1982. So throughout the life of the Cold War, this organization is going to grow. Okay, and what causes these countries to unite is the idea of collective security. So no longer are they pushing containment on their own. They, as a collective, are going to ensure the security of each other. Now, the Soviets are going to see this formation of NATO as an action that forces them to take their own security measures and make their own agreement with their own sphere of influence, and true to their word, they are going to initiate the Warsaw Pact, which is going to be signed a couple weeks after West Germany formally joined NATO in 1955. The Warsaw Pact is going to include places like Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the German Democratic Republic, which is East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania. And what this does is build up the other side of the argument. The Warsaw Pact is going to say the exact same thing. They're going to coordinate their own collective security and defense of its members in order to deter the enemy's attack. So it's a kind of this for that. We form NATO, they form the Warsaw Pact, and this only adds fuel to the fire of the Cold War for the years to come. So let's look at the first real big push of the Cold War for the United States. So we have to kind of go back a little bit. We are going to see that the United States is going to get itself involved with a civil war among leaders and ideas post World War II in communist China. Now, when we look at what was happening in China, we kind of have to go back to the year 1946, a year after Japan's surrender in World War II. A civil war is going to break out between a group, KMT, and communist forces. Now, the United States, of course, is going to push against and support anybody who is fighting communism post World War II. But this fight between the leader Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong is going to put the United States in its first place where we are actively helping to defeat the spread of communism. So Chiang Kai-shek is going to lead a government that loses a good deal of support because it was massively passive towards Japan during World War II and post World War II, and its people feel as though the government didn't do enough to protect them from the evils of Japan. Also, under Chiang's government, they pushed increasingly conservative policies that really favored landowners and mercantile interests and alienated 90% of the population, which was peasants. So, the United States backing a leader like this, it's going to be something that we do quite often in the fight against communism. Not necessarily someone who is a good leader, but someone who represents anybody but communism. Mao Zedong, because of this treatment of the people and their lack of support of Chiang, we're going to see Mao Zedong gain popularity with a platform that he is going to speak to the majority. He says, I am going to help the peasantry, which has been ignored by the government for years now. And that's what the people needed to hear. So the people are going to side with Mao Zedong, and we see China fall to communism in this time. And what we kind of have been fearing, this spread of communism comes to life because now the most populous country in the world falls to communism, and it becomes the People's Republic of China. These ideas are going to tie together. So let's take a little bit of time to go back and talk about the happenings in Korea, and then we'll tie in China into this history here. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire, but post World War II, it's going to fall under the control of the United States and the Soviet Union. Because it had belonged to Japan, that land is going to be split between the US and the Soviets. The northern half of Korea is going to be under Soviet control, while the southern half is going to become under control of the US, being split at the 38th parallel, right straight through the middle. But what happens in Korea is kind of representative of the entirety of the Cold War. We see in August of 1945 the split in Korea occur, and by the end of the decade, there are going to be two states that had formed on the peninsula. In the south, we're going to have an anti-communist dictator who really had enjoyed the support of the American government, because we are going to prop up this leader, Rae-hee, in southern Korea. In northern Korea, the communist dictator Kim Sung is going to have a different kind of support, where in the south, the United States is a little reluctant to have as much participation in the government. In the south, in the north, we are going to see that the Soviet Union is going to enthusiastically support this leader, enthusiastically help bring about control and put down any skirmishes, and have no challenges. Now, neither leader is going to be content to remain on their side of the Soviet-U.S. divide, the 38th parallel. Instead, they're going to push to gain control of the entire peninsula. Nearly 10,000 North and South Korean soldiers are going to be killed in the battle before a war even begins that the United States and Soviet Union are formally involved in. So let's take a look at the Korean War. The Northern Korean forces are going to be the first to cross the 38th parallel. And as far as the rest of the world is going to be concerned, when looking at this crossing of the 38th parallel, this isn't going to simply be a border dispute between two unstable dictators on either side. Okay, instead, what this is going to represent is the first step in the communist campaign to take over the world. And for that reason, non-intervention is going to be considered an absolutely terrible decision. We can't not intervene. So what we see is that the United States is going to look on to what is happening here and become an active member. The fight on this Korean peninsula is going to represent the larger global struggle between the East and the West, the good and the evil in the Cold War. The Northern Korean army is going to push past that 38th parallel and take the capital in South Korea, which is Seoul. When this happens, the United States is going to ready its troops for a war against communism itself. At first, the war is going to be a defensive one, trying to push communists out of South Korea, and it went pretty badly. The Northern Korean army was very well disciplined, very well trained, very well equipped, while Southern forces are going to be frightened, confused, and seem pretty inclined to flee the battlefield instead of stand up for itself. At this point, when the Korean War is taking place, it's also one of the hottest, driest summers on record, and American soldiers are going to have to adapt to the conditions. And because of the heat, American soldiers are often going to be forced to drink water from rice paddies that had been fertilized with human waste. And as a result of this, you're going to see disease run rampant, illness run rampant, and this conflict involving the United States is going to become one where we begin these wars where our troops are stationed in conditions that they're not used to, and be fighting against an ideology in the name of the country that they came to serve. And fighting an ideology, it's hard sometimes to pinpoint the enemy. Now, you might be asking yourself, how is the United States even here? Well, the way the United States gets involved in this conflict is through the United Nations. Once Northern Korean forces crossed that 38th parallel, the United Nations is going to vote to repel the armed attack. And who's the muscle within the United Nations? That would be the United States. Now, initially, we are going to push back. So you can see the first map there is, let me circle it for you. Maybe. The first map here is going to be the first attack from the Northern Korean forces, passing that 38th parallel, taking the capital of Seoul, and kind of decreasing that control of the Southern forces down to a very small portion. Now, once the United Nations gets involved, aka the United States, we're going to see this repelling attack where we squeeze the North Korean forces back up to the top again. Now, this third map here is going to be the push of the Northern Korean forces with the help of Communist China. We are going to see that once the United States, American troops cross the boundary and head north, Communist China is going to start to worry about protecting themselves from what they called an armed aggression against Chinese territory. So the Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, is going to send troops to North Korea and warn the United States to keep away, or it will be subjected to a full-scale war. So now this conflict between Northern and Southern Korea, which could be classified as more of a civil war, has grown into a greater conflict, and what we fear is coming for us is the threat of World War III. This is something that President Truman does not want. They were sure that a war would lead to Soviet aggression in Europe, that could tumble into the deployment of atomic weapons and millions of senseless deaths. So this threat of World War III coming from the potential conflict between Northern and Southern Korea could lead us right straight into a larger nuclear war, and that is something that no leader wants at this time. Now, General MacArthur, we've heard his name before. He got famous for his island hopping strategy in World War II, is going to be the right-hand man of Truman in this conflict in Korea. General MacArthur had this ideology, this onlook of the war, saying that if we back off in Korea and we don't match the Chinese aggression with our own forces, that could be seen as appeasement, and that was unacceptable in this war against communism. But President Truman is trying to look for a way to prevent war with China, not provoke it like MacArthur was pushing for. To MacArthur, this was an all or nothing. MacArthur says, let's take this conflict, let's push past Korea, let's go right into China, let's defeat the communist forces in China, and it doesn't matter what the consequences are. But Truman, seeing the bigger picture, is going to be at odds against MacArthur's view of how this should be handled. In in March of 51, MacArthur is going to send a letter to Joseph Martin, which was the House Republican leader, and who shared the same idea as MacArthur, pushing against all-out war against China. And in this letter, they're talking to each other about how they could probably force a declaration of war here. And MacArthur is going to say there is no substitute for victory against international communism. We just have to go all out. Now, this letter is going to be leaked. Truman is going to read it, and on April 11th, the president is going to fire the general for insubordination, for going against his ideas. That's how far we were willing to go to not go to war against China, to not turn this into a bigger conflict. After more than 2 years of negotiations, there is going to be an armistice on July 27th, 1953. In this agreement, the leaders come together, and a stalemate is the result of the Korean War. Now, Eisenhower is going to come into the presidency with this stance that he will end the conflict in Korea in the election of 1952. And he ultimately delivers, maybe not what he was promising there, but Eisenhower will win the election of 1952 and push for this end to the conflict. The way he gets this settlement to kind of come together is with the threat of nuclear weaponry. The United States now has the ultimate trump card. We had used nuclear weaponry to end a conflict, and we can kind of fall back and say we'll use it again. And Eisenhower uses that to his benefit to push this ending of the conflict. So in 1953, the agreement is down to the boundary will be reestablished between North and South Korea at the 38th parallel. And in this agreement, South Korea gets an extra 1,500 miles of territory to create a 1,500 square miles of territory. And they agreed to create a 2-mile wide demilitarized zone. And maybe you've seen this on the news. That demilitarized zone is kind of the no crossing point. The Korean War is a relatively short but very bloody conflict. Nearly 5 million people are going to die in this conflict. More than half of these, about 10% of Korea's pre-war population, is going to be civilians. This rate of casualties is higher than World War II and the Vietnam War's civilian casualty count. We're going to see about 40,000 Americans die in action in Korea and more than 100,000 wounded. And this conflict is one that is a part of the Cold War, which is why I say I challenge the definition that a Cold War is a war without wars, and that label that we give to this time period, because war is very real, and the lives lost in these conflicts are very real, and the numbers are very high. Today, there is a memorial for those veterans, and they are remembered at the Korean War Veterans Memorial, which is located near the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which is a series of 19 steel statues of servicemen. So there is some recognition here for those lost in the Korean War. We are going to continue our talk on the Korean War, or the Cold War, into the next section. Our next piece that we have to look at that's a part of this Cold War is the nuclear arms race. Uh, the nuclear arms race is going to have a building of history here that goes all the way back to World War One. After World War One, countries are going to show interest in arms control. Remember, Woodrow Wilson, in his 14-point speech, had said that in order to have this peace in a post-war world, reduction of arms was necessary. The United States held the Washington Naval Conference with the United States, Britain, and Japan, where a treaty was signed to restrict arms. But in the mid 1930s, Japan chose not to renew this agreement, and Germany had violated the Treaty of Versailles and had begun to rearm. And since then, a new arms race had been created. When we look at this arms race, it's going to start in Europe between Germany, France, and Britain, and in the Pacific Ocean between Japan and the United States. And this is going to continue into World War II. Now, fueling the flame of this building arms race was the decision of the United States to drop the atomic bomb without telling the Soviet Union that we plan to use atomic weaponry. And when we make that decision, instead of discouraging the Soviets to build up their atomic weaponry, we fuel them to test their own atomic bombs. And once this happens and it becomes this war or this race of atomic weaponry, the nuclear arms race has been triggered. Now, once we use the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union is going to start testing their own weaponry, and the United States is going to respond in 1952 by testing destructive hydrogen super bomb. And the Soviet Union is going to follow suit in 1953. And just 4 years later, both countries are going to test their first intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the arms race is going to go to a whole new, absolutely terrifying level. So we just see this building of technology, this building of weaponry, and that's a whole other layer of the Cold War that adds to this terrifying approach. Now, in this nuclear arms race, there is kind of a piece to knowing, and I say this is terrible. There is no peace to knowing this, but there was this kind of agreement between the United States and the Soviets of mutually assured destruction. What we see is that we know that we both hold weapons that could absolutely destroy the other, and each of us do want to avoid war, but not to the point where we'll stop building up weapons. And the way that we avoid war kind of becomes counterproductive in that we avoid the next war by building up enough weapons that could blow the other one off the face of the planet. But we promise not to really use them because we know if we do, then they're just going to use theirs against us and we're both destroyed. So mutually assured destruction doesn't stop us from producing these weapons. It just kind of makes us think twice before using this weaponry. Now, one piece that I did not mention that I'll go back to is Truman created the Atomic Energy Commission, and this was a federal agency that was created in 1946 to manage the development, use, and control of atomic nuclear energy for the military and civilian applications. And that's going to be under which that we see the hydrogen bomb get created. Now, this nuclear arms race doesn't just stop with Truman's presidency. It takes on a life of its own. And it continues into Eisenhower's presidency, Eisenhower becoming president in 1952. Eisenhower, in his presidency, also inherits the policy of containment. Containment being containing the threat of communism, the spread of communism, kind of at all costs. Now, Eisenhower's Secretary of State is going to be John Foster Dulles. Dulles is going to be a staunch anti communist, and there is no gray area for him. Nations are either part of the free world or they're a part of the Soviet bloc. And he had very little time for anybody who wanted to be neutral or believed in non alignment. Secretary Dulles is going to have a tendency to speak very dramatically, which probably not a good thing for a guy in a position such as this that is very important. But anyway, in 1954, he's going to give a speech that said the United States would meet the Soviet provocations with their building up of weaponry, not necessarily where they occurred, but where the United States chose, based on its deterrent of massive retaliatory power. And this is a big statement. In 1956, Life magazine is going to interview Dulles, and he's going to describe that he had passed the word to the Chinese and the North Koreans that unless communist powers signed the North Korean armistice that created that stalemate, the United States would unleash its atomic arsenal. So he's putting out there this threat that the United States will use atomic weaponry against communist forces that don't come to the table in these discussions surrounding Korea. And what that does is Dulles claims that we're going to move to the brink of atomic war. And it does bring us to the end of the Korean War. It brings people to the table and it avoids a larger conflict, but it is also incredibly dangerous. And with the success of the use of this threat, Dulles kind of gets this false sense of security that he can use the idea of massive retaliation, where we will kind of match a small threat with a big reaction, and the idea of brinkmanship bringing us to the edge of an all-out atomic war. And he kind of comes back to this idea because it was successful once that we can use it over and over and over again in future standoffs. Uh, in reality, this atomic threat to China was less definitive than Dulles had claimed, though, and the Eisenhower administration policy of massive retaliation was far more cautiously based on the idea of the mutually assured destruction idea. So Dulles is going to push us to massive retaliation and brinkmanship, but he kind of speaks louder than what the actual discussion is. But the real threat is there, that we could go back and rest on this idea that we have the atomic weaponry and we will use it to anybody who doesn't do what we want them to do, and get to the brink of atomic war only to take a step back once we are satisfied. That is a very scary approach to foreign policy. It may be successful in some routes, but the day that somebody calls the bluff of the United States on our potential to use that atomic weaponry could be the day that we go into atomic war. And that's terrifying. John Foster Dulles. Now, we have to look at what the heck is going on in the United States while all of this is happening abroad. Following World War II, we are going to see that second wave of the Red Scare. Now, the first wave occurred post World War I when there was a successful communist uprising giving Lenin power. And we're going to see the same kind of thing happen post World War II, where the Democratic United States and the Communist Soviet Union become engaged in this conflict that we've been talking about now for a bit, the Cold War. This rivalry between the two superpowers is going to raise concerns in the United States that communist and leftist sympathizers inside the United States might actively be working as Soviet spies and might be posing a threat to the U.S. security. And we believe that there could be Soviet spies in the government working from the inside to kind of destroy our democracy. And these ideas are not totally unfounded. The USSR had been known to carry out espionage activities inside America with the aid of US citizens during World War II. And that puts us in a place where we're very apprehensive about Soviet influence. And this only heats up during the Cold War. U.S. leaders are going to decide to take action. In March of 1947, Truman is going to issue Executive Order 9835. This is also known as the Loyalty Order, also known as, you see on your screen, the loyalty checks. What this did was mandate that federal employees be analyzed to determine whether they were sufficiently loyal to the U.S. government. This loyalty program was a very scary development for a country that had prided itself on the concept of personal liberty and freedom of political organizations. So, what it essentially did was go through government employees and ask them to pledge their loyalty to the democracy of the United States, to the government of the United States. And that was supposed to be the end-all be-all if there were communists in the government. But that's just one of the actions that we take because of this fear of the Red Scare. What this could do, though, is potentially lead to the destruction of our own democracy from the inside out. And let's take a look at some other actions that the United States is going to take. So the Smith Act is going to be put in place in 1940. What it did was make it illegal to teach or advocate for the overthrow of the U.S. government. Now, that doesn't really sound like it's okay. So it means, I mean, I understand. So the Smith Act, the goal is supposed to weaken the Communist Party. It's supposed to weaken the idea of establishing anarchy in the United States. I get it. But it's going to be challenged because we're supposed to be allowed to choose if we support our government or not. We're supposed to be able to express ourselves for and against the government that we have in the United States. Which brings us to the case of Dennis versus the U.S. Raymond Dennis, who was a member of the Communist Party, is going to fight against the Smith Act, stating that it violated the First Amendment. The Supreme Court is going to find that the Communist Party, and listen to this language, presented a clear and present danger to the United States, and the Smith Act could therefore limit the speech of the Communist Party to incite others to join the Communist Party and potentially overthrow the United States. This goes back to the case of Schenck versus U.S. that we talked about when that clear and present danger precedent is created. The Supreme Court is going to cite it again here, saying that the Communist Party creates an environment where an uprising could destroy our democracy. Therefore, it is okay. The McCarran Act is also going to be passed in 1952. What this did is attempt to put quotas on immigrants coming to the U.S. from nations that we saw high communist populations. And it's meant to prevent communists from coming to the United States, and it included that members of the communist and communist front organizations were subject to deportation. Truman is going to call this legislation un-American in his last days as president. He's going to call it un-American and inhumane. Now, this goes back to the immigration quotas that were established in the National Origins Act, the Emergency Quota Act, where we have already created a precedent where we can limit who is coming from where to the United States. We do it again with the McCarran Act. We're targeting populations of people coming from somewhere that we believe those people are a threat before they even get here, who may be escaping the conditions that we're trying to prevent from occurring here. Think about it. If people are coming from a communist country, isn't it just as likely that they're escaping communism rather than bringing it with them? Just an idea, just a proposal. But Congress is going to override Truman's veto and put this into place. And that just shows the height of the fear of communism in the United States. Not only are we loyalty checking in the government, but we're seeing legislation be passed to prevent the spread of communism. Now, the United States is going to take one more action that we're going to continue the discussion of which in class this week. But the creation of the House of Un-American Activities Committee is going to grow during this Red Scare, the second wave of the Red Scare. Now, the goal of HUAC, which is the House of Un-American Activities Committee, is to investigate fascist, Nazi, or communist activity. And this is going to be formed in 1938. And its role was to look at these organizations that had become very active during the Great Depression and examine the activities of other groups as well on the political left. Think about why we would create this, okay? 1938, Great Depression. We're seeing in the world these dictatorships rise to power in the same environment that we had in the United States. So the goal of this committee upon its foundation was to make sure that we didn't fall to the same fate that many places in Europe had fallen to. But when we look at HUAC during the time of the Cold War, it kind of goes way far left from what it was created to do. Now, the House of Representatives is going to run this committee in search of communists in the United States. And it kind of looks like a trial, okay? You have representatives on that committee that will interview people to try to investigate communism in the United States. Now, HUAC is going to use subpoena power to try to find these communists. Anybody suspected of being communist is going to be brought before the committee. They're going to receive a subpoena which demands that they appear before the committee. And they're going to be grilled about their political beliefs and activities, and then asked to provide names of other people who had taken part in communist activities in the United States. Additionally, figures identified in this manner are going to receive subpoenas widening the committee's probe. So it may start with a group of 5 people, but each one of those 5 may give names of 5 more, and then all of a sudden we have 25, and then, I'm not very good at exponential math, but it just grows and grows and grows, and the committee's probe just gets larger and larger. Individuals who refuse to answer the committee's questions or provide names could be indicted or found in contempt and be sent to prison. So they may just not want to talk, not because they're communist or not, but if they refuse, then they could be arrested. And originally, they had never, when they get called before HUAC, they were not in any trouble. They were not guilty of a crime. But if they took the 5th, it created an impression that they were guilty, so therefore they would be arrested and sent to prison. Additionally, those who refuse to cooperate Even if they weren't thrown in prison, they're going to be blacklisted by their employers. They could lose their jobs and be prevented from working in their chosen industry just because they refused to answer questions using their Fifth Amendment right that we have. Critics are going to claim that HUAC's tactics are going to be just a witch hunt that trampled citizens' rights and ruined their careers and reputations. These critics are going to argue that most people that went before the committee had broken no laws, but were just being targeted for their political beliefs and for exercising their right to free speech, which in the Bill of Rights we have. Supporters of the committee, on the other hand, are going to believe that the efforts of HUAC are justified given the grave threat to the U.S. security posed by communists. So you have the United States being divided on what HUAC is allowed and what they are not allowed to do. The HUAC investigations are going to delve into many areas of American life, but they're going to pay special attention to the motion picture industry, Hollywood, which was believed to harbor a large number of communists. Not wishing to get on the wrong side of Congress or the movie going public, many of the film industry executives did not speak out against the investigations. And many of the major studios are going to impose strict blacklist policies against actors, directors, writers, and other personnel that are going to be implicated in communist activity. So the Hollywood was put in a very precarious position here, because if they criticized HUAC, then all the people who supported it wouldn't come and see their movies. If they supported HUAC, then all of the people who saw it as a violation of rights wouldn't come and see their movies. So they kind of played the numbers game and said there's less people that are going to be mad at us if we are, going with the actions of HUAC than if we go against. The film industry investigations are going to reach their peak surrounding the Hollywood 10, which is a group of writers who were called to testify in October of 1947. The all-male group of screenwriters, producers, directors are going to refuse to cooperate with the investigation, and they're going to use their appearances before HUAC to denounce the committee's tactics. All are going to be cited for contempt of Congress and sentenced to prison terms, in addition to being blacklisted from working in Hollywood. This is going to be huge. The use of the Fifth Amendment by the Hollywood 10 and their following blacklist for being potential communist supporters is going to result in the case of Watkins versus U.S. In this Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court declares that witnesses before HUAC did not have to name radicals that they knew of. They don't have to. They can take the Fifth Amendment. That is our right, and that is okay. So the Hollywood 10 became famous for using their right and challenging the power and the authority of this committee that had grown way beyond what it was supposed to be in its origination. And we're going to continue to talk about HUAC and the actions during the Red Scare in class this week. And if you have any questions on any of this material, you let me know. Don't forget that you have your assignments of Journal 28, Why I Wrote the Crucible, and your short paper all due this week, and then your unit exam is on Friday.